Hello and welcome to the radiotimes.com Doctor Who podcast. My name's Hugh.
My name's Morgan.
And this week we're talking about something a little bit different. Obviously, the news recently has been, or the rumoured news, that Jodie Whittaker may be leaving Doctor Who, moving on to Pastors New. And someone else will be moving into Pastures Who. I slightly messed up that sentence, but I still think the joke works. And yeah, basically, because of that, the Doctor Who rumour mill has been in full effect. The rumour mill, incidentally, a setting for season 13, I like to think, where the almost could have been king likes to hang out. And yeah, basically, everyone on the internet is throwing out their predictions, and the bookies are throwing out their bets for, their odds rather, for who could be the next Doctor. And something struck me, which has struck me every time we've had a new Doctor, coming in, we don't know who they are yet, is, I mean, I don't know how to put this. A lot of the guesses are quite bad. I mean, I just don't feel like a lot of the guesses always seem quite like implausible and a little bit strange. By what I mean by that, I guess, is that like sometimes when you're like, oh, who could be a new Doctor, you sort of think, who are the sort of people who get picked to be in Doctor Who? Where are they at with their careers and stuff? I mean, you look at some of the people on the list and you're like, that just doesn't match up for me. Like if you're talking like Tilda Swinton, Idris Elba, Hollywood Marvel stars, are they going to come and do Doctor Who? I mean, Morgan, I've talked a lot and you haven't really said very much yet, so I'm going to throw it to you. I mean, do you know what I mean?
No, that's because I hugely disagree with everything you're saying. No, absolutely. I think you're right. I think a lot of the time when these star names are thrown up, you're right. If you look back at the history of casting the Doctor, they don't fit the mold. Someone like Tilda Swinton. I think there's two ways of looking at this. One is who would be good as the Doctor, and then there is who is in any way, shape, or form likely to be cast as the Doctor. Now, saying that Tilda Swinton, I'm not saying Tilda Swinton wouldn't be great as the Doctor. She probably would be fantastic. But is she likely to take on that role? Probably not. If you look back at the history of who's been cast as the Doctor, it's normally one of two things. Sometimes it's a complete unknown or a sort of rising star, your Matt Smiths, or it's a character actor with an interesting career and often, a very sort of respected back catalogue, but usually they don't have one defining role. That's normally key, because the Doctor is that defining role. It's the role that goes on to. So if you take someone like David Tennant, who was kind of emerging at the point at which he was cast as the Doctor, and he'd had Casanova, which was he was playing the lead, and but it was the Doctor became the role that people now associate with him. I think the one exception to that in recent history was probably Peter Capaldi, right? Who was not just sort of a well-known character actor, but he had arguably a defining role in Malcolm Tucker from The Thick of It. So that was slightly more left field. But generally, it does tend to be those character actors who are well respected in their field, but not quite yet stars. They're like on the brink of becoming star names, household names, and Doctor Who is what then takes them to that next level.
I completely agree. I've actually written a piece, which you can read on radiotimes.com, where I make the exact same argument. So that's how exciting this podcast is. Just two guys who think the same things. But yeah, no, I agree with you. I think with Peter Capaldi also, you can slightly overstate the thick of it in terms of it was a really big role. And it was definitely like the thing he did, and he was famous for it. But, I don't know how much international kind of renown it would have had. And similarly, the thick of it was a sort of beloved sitcom. I don't know, well, maybe sitcom's the wrong word, sort of, I don't know, like satire. And I always really enjoyed him in it, but I'm not sure the extent to which it was like a thing loads and loads of people watched, if you get what I mean. But yeah, exactly. And you could say the same for Jodie Whittaker. You look at Broadchurch, and that is obviously kind of like, if you had described her, you would have said Broadchurch is Jodie Whittaker, probably. But she's not like the only person in Broadchurch. Do you know what I mean? She's not the main person in Broadchurch. She's part of an ensemble. And I think that's, like you say, is key. It could be an up-and-comer. It could be a character actor. It's basically, it has to be someone for who this is a step up, right? And I'm not saying it's like a step down in terms of it's a bad role for someone who's more famous. I mean, it's someone for whom it's a challenge, and for whom it's sort of the offset of the really increased public scrutiny, the really long filming schedule, possibly away from your family 10 months out of the year, and all the kind of stress and the press attention that comes to Doctor Who is offset by the opportunity it offers you. So that doesn't tend to be someone like, Michael Sheen his name's on the list. I can imagine him doing it for like a shorter series or something if they were doing a special thing. I don't think he'd want to do it, full time. Similarly for like, Idris Elba's on the list, and like we said, Tilda Swinton. I'm just like, why would Idris Elba do this? Like, he might be like, oh, this would be a cool thing to do, but he'd be like, but I'm going to go and make millions in Fast and Furious, actually, if that's okay.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and also there's certain names where not only are they at a certain level of status, but they also maybe have more they're used to exerting more creative control over projects. Michaela Cole, you were mentioning, she's a name on the list, and she's someone who is very much, again, if you look at her as a performer, would she be a great doctor? Probably, but she's also more than just an actor. She's a writer, she's an author. Her projects, as you were saying earlier, they're very personal to her, right? So for her to, it would almost be it would certainly be an unexpected career choice, shall we say, for her to then opt to, I'm gonna take on the role of the Doctor, and I'm gonna fulfill this showrunner's vision.
Yeah, exactly. Like, she's just an I May Destroy You. Everyone's like, wow, what a creative genius. She had this really public kind of thing about how, she'd, not been able to get the creative control with some people, so she hadn't made the show with them. It was all about like, I have control of this is my story. And everyone's like, wow, she's like an auteur. She's this, this behind the scenes figure as well as on screen figure. And then it's like, right, now I'm going to go to Cardiff and do scripts about the Zygons. Like, not saying that's bad, but like someone else's scripts about the Zygons. Do you know what I mean? It's the same as Phoebe Waller-Bridge. It's funny because I said this with regards to like originally, oh, she's the one who people said was going to be Chris Chibnall's Doctor, before Jodie Whittaker was announced. But she's actually on the odds again, which kind of is often the way this goes. Like, a lot of people do just come up again and again. Like, Ben Wishaw's been here for years. But Phoebe Waller-Bridge is another one where it's kind of like, you look at Fleabag and, Killing Eve, the success of that, and like how she's in Hollywood making stuff and, doing all sorts. And it's like, I get why people talk about her because she's a prominent person and she's quite trendy. I mean, not I don't mean that disparagingly, but she's sort of someone you hear about a lot. But that doesn't mean she'd necessarily want to do it. Like, again, not because it's beneath her, but because she's got other stuff going on that's like she's more creatively involved in.
Yeah, and it's not to say that playing the Doctor is creatively unfulfilling. Like, I think if you're an actor, it's probably like one of the best roles. Like, it's so creatively fulfilling. I remember speaking to Matt Smith shortly before, like I think after it had been announced he was leaving, but before he'd left, and he was talking about all the things he'd miss, and he said that he'd miss how this was a character who could kind of turn on a sixpence, and there was you get to kind of play a little bit of everything with the Doctor, because you get to play the clown, but you get to play the genius, you get to play the intergalactic hero, you get to play the kind of the action hero, but you also get to play the mad scientist. Like, it's got so many different layers to it. You get to do so much, so it's probably really rewarding, a really rewarding part as an actor. You get to be a children's hero, you get to be all these things. But if you're someone who, if you're a Phoebe Waller-Bridge, if you're a Michaela Cole who is used to having, a larger degree of creative control over your projects, it's not the one for you. And that's not to denigrate Doctor Who. It's just to say it would be a very surprising career sidestep to make at this point.
The thing with it is, I think it really says something about the role of the Doctor that you do have such sort of a wide range of names thrown in. Like the fact that, when they're talking about the next detective in Death in Paradise, they're not like, oh yes, it'll be Harry Styles. Do you know what I mean? Like, but Harry Styles is, really great, really buzzy, does some acting. Death in Paradise is a show where they could, get in a new actor, but you wouldn't put the two of them together. Same thing with, like I said to you earlier, it's like, who's the new, troubled cop in Line of Duty? Oh, it's Chris Hemsworth. Like, no, that just wouldn't happen. Whereas with Doctor Who, you do get these sort of names. And I think it's because the role is so cool and so interesting that you can sort of imagine anybody wanting to do it. And I think in a lot of ways, people would be happy to do it. It's just the commitment, and also the fact that, it is a not low budget, but it's a comparatively low budget, BBC show, which has a lot of prominence because it has this great cultural cachet, but that doesn't necessarily mean that absolutely everybody is going to kind of, buy into it in that way. The way I see it is you have a few kind of different genres of people who people guess at, which tends to be, like we've said, there tends to be like the ridiculous massive Hollywood stars. There tends to be the quite buzzy people who are kind of coming up at the moment. For example, Ollie Alexander from It's a Sin, and Lydia West from It's a Sin. Basically the entire cast of It's a Sin, I think people have said at various points.
Well, this does touch on, I did see a tweet which is pertinent to what we're talking about, by the Twitter user at hello this is Ivan, and the tweet was, actor, gives a reasonably charismatic screen performance. Person on Twitter, they must be the next Doctor Who. It's which very much plays into that whole thing of someone who's buzzy, who's a great actor, who's charismatic on screen. It's like, wow, they should be Doctor Who, and it's like, well, not necessarily. Like they're just again, maybe they'd be great, but it's not like a given.
Yeah, definitely. And I think we can kind of fall into that trap because it's weird because we have had a lot of Doctor recastings and they are always handled a little bit differently. Like, for example, when Christopher Eccleston was leaving, if you were looking around at like who's a kind of vibrant young actor who I'm seeing at the moment, David Tennant was that guy. So like it could happen. And Matt Smith was a bit different because I remember when that happened, the day before it was announced, they had a list of the like odds and it was all these names. And then at the end it was, and this guy called Matt Smith. And I was like, well, it's definitely him then, isn't it? Because like, why would he be on there?
I remember having the exact same experience where like it'd been on the news and think they'd been talking about it before, and it was like, oh, the rumored names are James Nesbitt and Patterson Joseph, and I was like, okay. And then like the night before that episode of Doctor Who Confidential went out, it was like James Nesbitt, Patterson Joseph, and some bloke called Matt Smith who no one's ever heard of. Like, that seems suspicious. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Like I remember when they were announcing Pearl Mackie again as a companion, it was like someone put a massive amount of money on at a bookies about basically, oh, Pearl Mackie will be the new companion. It was like, I mean, if that isn't true, they're very, very strange person. It wasn't like it was, someone really famous. But yeah, so there's them. And then I think the third type, going back to what I was saying of the types of people, is something you said earlier, which is before we were recording, which is basically the type of person who people vaguely think seems a bit like the Doctor. So on the list, you have Richard Ayoade, you have Tom Rosenthal, I guess, from Friday Night Dinner, Chris Marshall, who pops up every so often, Michael Sheen to an extent, Richard Rankin, who people might know from Outlander and 13. You got Matt Berry, and then like Ben Whishaw. And I think people kind of like vaguely sort of, with someone like Matt Berry, like, oh yeah, he's sort of flamboyant. With Richard Ayoade, like, oh, he's kind of nerdy, he's got funny hair. Chris Marshall is like, oh yeah, he's like a sort of thin English guy in a suit. Like you sort of see it, but
Chris Marshall as well is like, if you squint, he sort of looks a bit like a young Tom Baker, kinda. Like you've kind of got
And Richard Rankin is a great actor, I will say, but he is a bit like if you were sort of trying to cast David Tennant again, but like not have David Tennant, it would be sort of similar to that.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think there's kind of, and I don't want to sound too snobby about this, but I do think a lot of those types of guesses come from people who don't watch Doctor Who, but kind of have a vague knowledge of what Doctor Who is, and they go, oh yeah, a skinny guy in a suit with interesting hair, who's maybe got it helps if he's got a slightly eccentric public image, someone like Matt Berry or Richard Ayoade, or Stephen Fry.
Stephen Fry, yeah. Richard Ayoade is a good example because he's someone who, like, when you actually look at it, it would be incredibly bizarre career choice of him because he hasn't actually done that much acting. Like, he's done some sitcom acting where he plays something quite close to his public persona, and he does a lot of presenting, and he's like a quite artistically admired indie director. Do you know what I mean? And he writes all these complex books about film, and I'm like, I don't think he'd want to do this. Like, I don't think he'd think it was beneath him, but I think he would just not want to do it.
He almost ticks two of our boxes in being wrong, in the sense of like, if you're just going by his public persona that he played nerdy Moss on the IT Crowd, and he's got that kind of public persona of being a bit eccentric, that's not a good enough reason to cast him. But also, would he want to do it? No, because if you like, the real Richard Ayoade is someone who exhibits a far greater degree of creative control over his projects. So like on neither level is he a suitable candidate, really, if you stop and think about it.
Yeah, and it's weird. Like, again, I don't want it to seem like we're kind of trying to, kill anyone's dreams here or like have a go at anybody. It's just something that always strikes me. I'm kind of like, obviously it doesn't really matter because it's all just, speculation. We don't know anything. Yeah. And the thing with these odds are that they're so wild because there isn't anything to go on. Ollie Alexander's only jumped up in the ratings because a journalist forced Russell T Davies to say he might be good in Doctor Who. And then a different journalist asked John Barrowman, do you reckon that? And he was like, yeah, probably.
Yeah. But going back to, we're not criticizing anyone for throwing these names out there. I think because as well, I think something we've talked about previously in terms of who could be the next Doctor is the casting of Jodie Whittaker and then more recently of Joe Martin has really broadened people's horizons and their outlook on who and what the Doctor could be. I think like I am as guilty as anyone of if you ask me now who should play the Doctor or who could play the Doctor, my answer would be very different to what it would be or what it would have been pre
Mm.
Jodie's casting, I think I probably would have fallen not necessarily entirely, but more into the trap of going, it should be this white guy with interesting hair. Like someone I was a big sort of supporter of for years, I was like, Damien Maloney, who he
Yeah, from
played
Being Human.
from being, yeah, he played the vampire Hal in Being Human, and he's kind of, he's young and he's good looking, but he's also very charismatic. He's a great actor, and on Being Human, he kind of played a slightly eccentric vampire, which isn't a million miles away from a slightly eccentric Time Lord. So you kind of go, oh, he'd be a good fit. But then, and I think, again, he's a great actor. I think he would be good, but he's a very obvious choice because you've seen him do something like that before, right? And that's the other trap, is like, I've seen them do something a bit like that before. Jodie Whittaker had never done anything really like Doctor Who before. I think she's talked about the fact that this is actually, despite the fact that she's playing an alien that's millions of years old, this is the persona of the Doctor is a bit more close to her real persona than role she's played, where she tends to play grieving mothers and that type of thing. So at the time, I would have gone, yeah, Damien Maloney's the one. Now I would go, yeah, okay, maybe. But also, there's all these other names that previously I wouldn't have considered. And Jodie and Joe Martin's casting has made it feel far more real that these other names could now be a possibility.
Yeah, looking at like what Joe Martin had done before and what Jodie had done before, you wouldn't have been like, oh yeah, I see what their Doctor would be like. Like weirdly, meeting Jodie and stuff like that, you definitely see where her Doctor comes from because it's very like her, and so you can see. So it's immediately clear why Chris Chibnall was like, I should cast Jodie because she's kind of her Doctor in real life in a funny sort of way. In a similar way to actually how Peter Capaldi is. Like Peter Capaldi was not like Malcolm Tucker, but he is quite a bit like the 12th Doctor, I'd say. Although a bit quieter.
It's always it's a slight of a sidebar, but I definitely think there's always two types of Doctor Who actors or Doctor actors. One is which their Doctor is like an exaggerated, more eccentric version of themselves, and one is where it's a complete performance. And I think Jodie it's kind of like an exaggerated version of her real personality. I think Tom Baker, similarly, it's a kind of exaggerated version. And then there's ones which are more definitely like a performance. So Patrick Troughton, Peter Davison, Peter Capaldi, I think, and Matt Smith as well. I think in particular, like the early 11th Doctor is a bit more like Matt, but later on it becomes it moves further and further away from Matt. If you ever meet Matt Smith, he's like a lot more kind of grounded and down to earth. And I don't want to say laddie, but like he's a bit more of a bloke.
There's a definite vibe.
Yeah, like whereas his Doctor became far more kind of eccentric and effete and a bit more posh, and didn't have the same voice as Matt. Even like it changed a lot. So that was far more of a performance.
Yeah. So when you look at these actors, like, and if you say you're looking at like Chris Marshall and what he did in Death in Paradise and being like, oh, I can imagine that person being the Doctor. That's kind of the opposite, I think, of sometimes what the production crew are looking for, where they're like, we want to look at someone who people would never have thought of for the Doctor, but then once they see them, they could never think of anyone else. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. And going back to what I was saying, you kind of either want someone who has never played a Doctor type role before, but actually would be perfect for it, which is the kind of the Jodie Whittaker, or you want someone who can perform as the Doctor. It's not necessarily their own persona, but they can perform as the Doctor. But again, you kind of want it to be someone who you've never seen do that before. It's like, oh, of course they'd be perfect, but that's the reaction you want, isn't it? It's like, of course they're perfect, but I never would have thought of them in a million years.
Yeah,
that's the reaction you want.
It's like when Jodie Whittaker was announced, it was not what I was expecting at all. I mean, I was like, she'd be really good actually. Like when you sort of think about it, and same with Peter Capaldi. Like, I mean, I think some people were expecting him, but once he'd been cast, I was like, oh right, that's quite different. And then I was like, I bet he'd be very good. Do you know what I mean? Like it's that moment where you go, oh, actually. It was trickier with Matt Smith because he hadn't been in much, but I had seen him in Party Animals. So
yeah. And Moses Jones. I don't know if anyone remembers that.
The classic Moses Jones.
Yeah, no, and I think as well, there's always an inclination from the Doctor Who creative team to cast against type, if that's the right word. Like the new Doctor is always a bit of a reaction to the old Doctor, I guess partly to do something new and interesting, but also partly to kind of avoid direct comparisons. And that's normally the case. I mean, the 11th Doctor and the 10th Doctor, they're maybe, a little more similar than some others, but like definitely from like 11 to 12, there's a big contrast, right, which is intentional from Matt to Capaldi, and then from Peter Capaldi to Jodie Whittaker, there's intentionally like a big shift. And I think again, a trap that people, and I'm not putting myself above this, a trap that people can fall into is to go not just who is a bit like the Doctor, but also who's a bit like the Doctor we just had.
Yeah.
And if anything, the casting tends to go against that. So if you're looking for the next Doctor now, you probably don't want to look at someone who's a bit like Jodie Whittaker in terms of like their persona and the way in which, you know, you kind of want to go against that. And I don't necessarily mean to cast a man again. I think you could definitely cast another woman Doctor who's totally different to Jodie in so many different ways.
Yeah, I mean, I saw on the list of the bookies odds, which I keep going back to because it's handy. Maxine Peake was quite high, and I was like, well, that's too similar. Like that, you'd feel like they would. I mean, Maxine Peake could be a completely different sort of Doctor, but you feel like it's too similar, like a type. And same with like Vicky McClure. Oddly, I'm just sort of like, I reckon she'd be quite good in it, but I don't think she'd be different enough. Do you know what I mean? I feel like you'd want, especially if it was another female Doctor. I think you'd need someone who was just so vastly different from Jodie's Doctor, because then the point isn't, oh, Jodie's the female Doctor. It's like, no, Jodie's the 13th Doctor, and here's the 14th Doctor. Do you know what I mean? I feel like it would make the point even better. Like, it's why, like, I thought like someone like Tania Miller, who like obviously people have talked about a bit. I was like, she to me felt plausible in that she's sort of been around and she's been in lots of stuff, but she hasn't had like that one big lead role. And she would be, you could see her being quite a different sort of more assertive Doctor, but without having exactly played that role in the past, even though she's played characters who are a little bit like that, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. No, I think she'd be great, and she is exactly that. She's someone, like you say, she's not had one defining lead role, but she's popped up in lots of great stuff and been very good in all of it. And she's always brought like a lot of sort of personality and character to it. And you go, oh, actually, she'd be really good. But again, I wouldn't necessarily have thought of her. And the reason often you don't think of these people is because they are so different to the person who's playing the role at the moment. But actually, that's exactly what you want from the next Doctor. So that's why it is so hard a lot of the time to guess who the next Doctor will be, because there's, you know, if you're looking for someone who you would never guess and also someone who has never played a role like the Doctor before, that is why it's so hard to accurately predict who the next Doctor will be. But that is ultimately who the next Doctor will be.
And happily, it's not us who have to make the decision. It's the BBC, Chris Chibnall, all that lot.
Yeah.
I mean, looking at the list of bookies odds, I was trying to think, if I had to sort of say someone from here, who would I think? And I was sort of like, weirdly, Friday Night Dinner's Tom Rosenthal. I was like, he'd be a bit similar to like the Matt Smith, David Tennant era, but I was like, I am sort of surprised to see he's there. And it isn't the sort of role I would associate him with, which made me think.
I do wonder if that's just he's young and English and skinny. Like, I do think there's some sort of, like,
but there's a lot of them around. Like Asa Butterfield's not on there.
Oh no, I'm sure I've seen him suggested on Twitter though, certainly.
Yeah, I've seen him suggested a few times.
I do feel like Tom Rosenthal, look, you know, he's a bit like if you got David Tennant and Matt Smith and
mushed them up.
Yeah, and through some kind of like the Fly style merging system, that was what would happen.
Maybe that's what happens when you put people through the rumor mill. You know,
yeah. You put David Tennant and Matt Smith in the rumor mill, and Tom Rosenthal emerges. I think that works both on a sort of literal, but also a metaphorical level.
And we'll have the rumor mill on Big Finish coming May 2022. We love stories. We have to mention Big Finish once per episode in case people don't know. It's part of our contractual obligation for some reason. But yeah, no, I know what you mean. It's really going to be quite interesting to see what they go with. Like, we could be completely wrong. We should say, like, it's a bit of a mug's game trying to predict what Doctor Who won't do, because often then you're wrong. And, you know, when we're all welcoming Chris Marshall as the 14th Doctor,
I was going to say, just
with Michaela Cole as his companion, we're gonna feel
just
like,
looking at my phone, I've got a release and it says Ben Whishaw is actually confirmed as the next Doctor. So
in a shock twist, it's actually Lawrence Fox. No, it's not. Finally, what the people wanted. I think that, generally speaking, I'm going to put my neck out and say that we've probably not heard the name of the next Doctor yet in serious discussion, would be my guess. And we'll return to this in a few months or years. You never know. We don't know exactly when Jodie is going to leave, if she is. We can come back and see if I was right. But like you said earlier, I think if people do kind of want to look for who it is, I'm not going to like go out with any names, because I reckon I don't know who it is yet, if you know what I mean, as in like, I might not even know the actor, but I reckon it's like you said, it's someone who's either starting out or who is a kind of sort of slightly older, but character actor, British, TV roles primarily, maybe the odd film, but not anything too big, who like has never quite had that one big defining role, and who this is the kind of big step for. I think that's what people need to be looking for. It's not going to be the big stars. It's not going to be someone who has already starred in a big TV show, probably as the lead.
Mm.
it's probably going to be someone sort of, like I said in my piece, more down to earth, ironically.
Yeah. I always like, it's not a direct comparison, but I do always equate it with one of those roles that has a lot of discussion around it and gets talked about a lot, and people are almost always suggesting unlikely candidates is James
I knew
Bond.
you were going to say
Where,
James Bond. Yeah, I thought
yeah,
about that earlier. Yeah.
where in much the same way as anyone who's like a bit eccentric with interesting hair gets thrown up for Doctor Who, anyone who wears a suit in a TV show is like, he could be James Bond. And it's like, yeah, but is that too obvious? Would he actually be any good? And no one would have predicted or did predict Daniel Craig, and actually Daniel Craig got quite a bit of flack initially. They're like, he's nothing like our vision of Bond, and then he was brilliant and everyone loved him. So it is similar in that sense of like, you want someone totally unexpected who will totally kind of upend your expectations rather than the obvious choice, because the obvious choice will just deliver what you expect or will kind of underwhelm because you have these expectations. You want to go completely left field.
I think you're right. And I think you're also right, the thing you said earlier about, I've got to say, like the list of prospective people who you do see people talking about this year is a lot more interesting because we've had Jodie Whittaker's Doctor. Like it suddenly opens up. Like there were always kind of some women on the shortlist, kind of, especially in more recent years, as a kind of, you know, nod to it. But now it feels like it's kind of a more serious consideration. Like you feel like it's a real different like mix of people this time. Like
I'm sure
there's still a lot of men on there, but like also, to be honest, I'd say the men are more similar than the women are.
Yeah, no, and I'm sure I've said this before, but there were always in the rumor mill again, like women who were uh their names were mentioned. But I think now it far more so, like if anything, on, you know, if you look at social media, it's more women that are being suggested more than men. I think people are expecting the next Doctor to be a woman.
Yeah.
And yeah, so it's definitely changed the conversation, I think, in a positive way, that it's bucked the trend, and long may the trend continue to be bucked.
I know what you mean. Yeah, I sort of agree with them. So I reckon, you know, if you had to put money on, I'd say 70-30. The next Doctor will probably be a woman, because as we've said before, it would seem like sort of like a step back or like a suggestion that it wasn't a good idea to not do it. But then again, they always say the best Doctor is, you know, ultimately the person who, you know, had the best audition, was the best person in the room, and that could be anybody. So, you know, who knows? We certainly don't, and we don't think most of the people talking online or in newspapers do either. But what do you think, people listening at home? Who do you think the next Doctor should be? Do you agree with our assessment of what, you know, you should be looking for in an actor's career for the next Doctor, or do you think we're talking rubbish? That's fine if you do. Just, you know, make sure you leave it in the comments of different videos, because we'll definitely see them there. No, I'm joking. Let us know what you think, and yeah, please let us know your picks for, you know, who you think the next Doctor should be, because, you know, you guys sometimes know things and hear things that we don't, and that would be very cool to hear. Next week we'll be talking more probably about regeneration and Doctor Who and stuff. I won't go into too many details in case we change our minds. And yeah, you can read our piece about this very topic, about, you know, why a lot of people are guessing the next Doctor wrong, on radiotimes.com, including you know, some of the predictions and why we don't think they're correct. And you can also hear loads more stuff from us about Doctor Who on the website, with some stuff about the latest Weeping Angels game, things like that. Lots of fun Doctor Who stuff. Until next time, I've been Hugh.
And I've been Morgan.
And neither of us is going to be the next Doctor. There's your big scoop. Goodbye.